Alright you guys, this next episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Defect, the Montebello Murders. This short story is based on a superseding indictment involving 25 members and associates of a Mexican Mafia street crew that was being orchestrated by Chuy Martinez and Jimmy Smokey Sanchez, both from Barrio Nuevo Estrada, VNE. This story isn't going to get into the full breakdown of that case with regards to how Chuy, Smokey, and some of the others got arrested. I'm going to do that in an upcoming profile. Instead, this story is going to focus on two individuals that defected who were potentially unindicted co-conspirators. So several other Mexican Mafia members such as Mariano Chuy Martinez, Jimmy Smokey Sanchez, Roy Spider Galvedon, and Juan Topo Garcia were also indicted as well. Just for the purpose of knowing how some of these guys fit into this story, the following individuals were all named in this particular indictment: Frank Sapo Fernandez, Juan Topo Garcia, Mariano Chuy Martinez, Jimmy Smokey Sanchez, Crispin Conejo Alvidrez, Fernando Cuate Alvidrez, Javier Alvidrez Duarte, Marcel Psycho Arevalo, Daniel Sporty Bravo, Mario Whisper Castillo, Robert Gypsy Cervantes, Roy Spider Galvedon, Dominic Solo Gonzalez, David David Contreras, Gerardo Blanco Jacobo, Robert Gato Mercado Jr., Ernesto Solo Murillo, Adrian Nieto, Rolando Rolo Ontiveros, Sally Peters, Jesus Dreamer Ramirez, Roland Capone Ramirez, Jesus Gizmo Rochin, and Suzanne Schoenberg. So this story is basically a runoff of the aforementioned indictment and goes into the details of why a city terrorist gang member and a close associate defected. Like all the other stories I put out, this one has all the nefarious elements of yet another classic Mexican Mafia story. It runs the gamut of betrayal, backstabbing, deception, double dealing, disloyalty, treachery, and duplicity. So before I get into the details of this story, let me reiterate again that I'm going to run another future profile that focuses on Chuy, Smokey, Chuco, his brother Blind Eye Eddie, and their neighborhood VNE, Barrio Nuevo Estrada. That profile is going to focus on a different kind of betrayal, and I'm going to touch on something that's not talked about too often: nepotism. I briefly touched on it in one of my recent stories, but I want to use Deadeye Eddie as an example. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Deadeye Eddie was a Mexican Mafia member who had a brother named Chuco. Chuco was also a well-respected Mexican Mafia member himself until it became known that he was a federal informant who cooperated with the FBI and ultimately testified in court. Although this didn't have nothing to do with Deadeye Eddie, it obviously put him in a precarious situation, and in the end, it reflected on him. There was a general consensus that led people to believe that Deadeye Eddie continued to be embraced and that this didn't end up having a negative effect on him. Slowly over the course of time, animus and resentment afflicted Deadeye Eddie. He incurred it. The damage that his brother Chuco inflicted on the Mexican Mafia created too much strife, and he basically became despised based on his association to his brother. That's another form of betrayal that needs to be talked about. As soon as Chuco testified, Eddie had a target on his back. His own brothers started creating their own reasons to take him out. People started speculating about why he was rarely being locked up. Eventually, Deadeye Eddie was taken out in Boyle Heights with 6 bullets from a .45 caliber handgun. Coincidentally, after 5 years, the alleged killer, Vincent Spanky Armendariz, was just recently arrested about a week and a half ago. Anyways, look for this story to come out along with the profile on VNE and some of the Mexican Mafia members that came out of this neighborhood sometime in the near future. So getting back to this story, this all goes back sometime to the beginning of 2001. A guy by the name of Michael Ornelas, who also went by Clarence, was working odd jobs painting and doing some auto body work in East Los Angeles. He grew up in an area in East Los Angeles called City Terrace. Although Clarence was never formally jumped into a street gang, he grew up with a lot of gang members from City Terrace and Slows 13. Some of them lived in his neighborhood, and others he had met when he was still going to school. Clarence was the type of individual who was always in the neighborhood associating with Slows 13 and City Terrace. When he was younger, he'd go buy up with members of these gangs, and then they'd go to one of the parks or to a schoolyard and drink 40s or 12 packs of malt liquor beer. Buying up is the term used to describe the act of going to a liquor store and then everyone pitches in whatever they got to buy beer. At times, when none of the older gang members would be there, it was common to post up in front of a liquor store and wait to ask someone who was old enough to buy up for us. I remember doing this myself. We'd wait until someone walked by that looked cool, and then we asked them to buy beer for us. 9 times out of 10, they'd laugh and do it. Unless they ended up being some kind of square, upstanding citizen of the community, they'd do it. They probably reflected back to the days when they used to do the same thing. We were just a bunch of young gang members trying to get our drink on. As Clarence got older, he started experimenting with drugs. It started with weed and alcohol, and then it progressed to some of the hard drugs: cocaine, heroin, meth, etc., etc. A lot of youngsters who experience drugs at a young age experiment with different drugs in phases. They try one, go through their experiences, and then they move on to the next one. Clarence was no different. He ran the gamut and tried them all. But unlike most youngsters who eventually stopped, he continued using meth and became an addict. He'd go periods of time where he'd go on some serious drug binges, and then there were times when he'd stop and take a break. Because Clarence lived right there on City Terrace, he grew up with Mario Whisper Castillo, Gerardo Blanco Jacobo, Michael Trix Gonzalez, and Robert Gypsy Cervantes. All these guys are named in this indictment. At one point in time, he was also neighbors with Marcel Psycho Arevalo, who was one of the more influential City Terrace gang members in the neighborhood. This is when Clarence was living at home with his parents. The house his parents owned was located right next door to where Psycho and his family lived, so they lived next door to each other all throughout their younger years. At times, Psycho and his primos, Spanish for cousins, would go by Clarence's parents' house and drink beer with them. When they got older, Clarence did a lot of detail work on Psycho's van. Clarence used to get high-end aftermarket parts discounted at the place he was working for, so he used to hook Psycho up and do a lot of work for him. Despite the fact that Clarence wasn't from City Terrace or Slows 13, he still considered these guys to be close friends, and he had their backs. If they needed a favor, he was there for them. Clarence was like that one guy from the neighborhood who never got jumped into the hood, but he was always around. Everybody knew who he was, and he was embraced on his own merits. You don't always have to be a gang member to be respected. There's a lot of good dudes that grow up in the hood from a young age and earn their respect based on how they carry themselves and what type of individuals they are. Some of them come across as being trustworthy and solid because they've proven themselves to be like that in the past. And this is how Clarence was. Despite the fact that he used drugs and would sometimes go on his runs, he was still somebody that was considered to be solid and trustworthy. Like I said, there's a lot of good dudes who didn't officially get jumped into a gang when they were coming up in the hood. But this doesn't mean they weren't exposed to that lifestyle. They still grow up seeing the same things and are entrenched in it like the rest of us. Coming from a family who has a long history of involvement in the gang lifestyle myself, I can tell you that there's a lot of us who have literally been entrenched in that lifestyle from the time we were running around in shitty diapers. It was a culture, a way of life that we were born into, not by choice, but by fate. For a lot of us, the gangs we got involved with in some ways became our surrogate parents, voids that we were missing at home. So at some point in 1998, Psycho showed up at Clarence's parents' house with two guns wrapped in blue bandanas. Both guns were .380s. One was black and one was chrome with a wooden handle. At the time, Psycho didn't offer up a lot of information about the guns. All he really told Clarence is that he needed a place to warehouse them and that they had bodies on them. When someone says a gun has bodies on them, this means that the gun has been used in a homicide. By 1998, Clarence had moved out of his parents' house and got his own spot in Pico Rivera, so this is where he took the guns to. Because Psycho indicated that the guns were hot and that they had bodies on them, Clarence buried them in his backyard, and that's where he left them. Although he didn't prior ask Psycho questions about his business, he found it a little suspicious that Psycho also swapped out the flashy rims he had on his van for some cheap aftermarket rims soon after he asked him to hold the guns. He had a fleeting thought that maybe Psycho might have gotten caught up in something, but again, he was street savvy enough to know better than to ask him anything about it. However, 6 months later, he found out exactly what Psycho was caught up in. One night as he was watching the local news, he caught a segment that showed Psycho and several other City Terrace gang members he knew had been arrested in connection with what was being referred to as the Montebello murders, a triple homicide. Not long after Psycho had been picked up and arrested, Trix showed up at his house in Pico Rivera to get the guns. Clarence didn't ask any questions. He just told Trix that they were buried in his backyard, and then together they dug them up. They dug up the guns using shovels and a pickaxe. The guns were buried in the corner of the backyard. When Clarence buried them, he used a tree as a marker, knowing he'd probably have trouble finding them when it came time to digging them back up. At first, they actually did have trouble finding them. Clarence started to panic and thought that maybe somehow somebody else must have dug them up. I'm sure nobody would have believed that one. After being buried for 6 months, the guns were actually hard to find. They probably shifted in the dirt. But after 45 minutes of poking around, they finally found them. Clarence assumed that Trix was just going to take the guns and do whatever he was going to do with them. But once they dug the guns up, Trix just kind of stuck around and had Clarence assist him. After taking both guns apart, they jumped into Clarence's car and tossed out different parts of the guns at various locations in Pico Rivera and Montebello. Trix threw a frame of one of the guns from a bridge over the San Gabriel River. Other parts were thrown out near the Montebello Town Center along Plaza Drive. At another point, Trix jumped out of the car, ran up a hillside, and threw the rest of the parts over a chain link fence. A few weeks after Clarence and Trix dug up the weapons and disposed of them, homicide detectives raided both of their houses. I'm not sure how they were implicated or who pointed law enforcement in their direction, but needless to say, they were both pressed and threatened to be charged if they didn't start talking. And I'm sure the homicide detectives probably spread it on real thick. If you guys don't cooperate, you're going to go down with conspiracy and accessory after the fact in a triple homicide. They probably told them that they were going to be added into this massive indictment with 25 other co-defendants and all that other good stuff. Whatever song and dance they gave these guys, it worked because they both agreed to start talking and they gave it all up. Clarence and Trix both claimed that they could lead detectives to the murder weapons used to kill the victims in this case. On June 15, 2001 and June 24, 2001, Clarence was formally interviewed. He primarily discussed the disposal of two .380 handguns. In his first interview, he claimed that he didn't do any favors for anyone in November of 1998 due to the fact that he was too strung out on drugs. Apparently, he claimed that all this happened during a period of time when he relapsed and had pretty much stopped associating with certain individuals. He tried to minimize his involvement by saying he went off the grid and wasn't really active in the hood at that time, which really wasn't relevant as it had nothing to do with him destroying their evidence. A lot of it also had to do with him protecting himself. According to him, he didn't want to put himself in any bad situations, so at the time, he just kind of fell back. In the interview, however, he stated that he had had two guns hidden in his backyard for about 6 months and then helped Trix dispose of them when he came by. During the time when he agreed to dispose of the weapons, he claimed he was tapped in with the active homies and was always willing to assist them wherever and however he could. After all, they were his friends, and although he denied having any knowledge about any triple homicide, he said he didn't think it was a big deal helping a friend dispose of some weapons. It's amazing how stupid some people will play when they have something like a triple homicide hanging over their head. Later on, when all the details started coming out, probably when the homicide detectives started showing them pictures or talking about who it was that got whacked, Clarence found out that he actually knew one of the victims. It was a guy named Richard. Clarence had knew this guy because his family owned several properties in City Terrace, and Richard himself was a small-time meth dealer. According to Clarence, he sold 8-balls and teeners, and Clarence would occasionally cop his dope from him. Later on, after Clarence signed a proffer agreement and had officially agreed to cooperate, he drew several maps of where the guns were disposed of before he actually took homicide investigators to all those same locations. Whether Trix was motivated by the fact that Clarence had flipped or whether he just knew he was chopped liver, he also sat down and agreed to cooperate as well. Trix signed his proffer agreement and officially spoke to the FBI and the prosecution on June 24th, June 26th, and July 2nd in 2001. In general terms, he discussed his involvement in disposing two guns. He talked about his connections to different people who were named in this indictment and what he was told about the murders. The following summary is a compilation of his 3 interviews. So Trix claimed he was familiar with the Mexican Mafia and how it operated due to the time he spent in prison. He said because he was knowledgeable about the M's inner workings and how the Sureño alliance was tied into them, that he also knew that Psycho was becoming more involved with the Mexican Mafia between 1997 and 1998, the period when they frequently talked on the phone. According to Trix, Psycho was open about his involvement with the Mexican Mafia and often exposed his business because he was proud to be associated with the organization. He wanted everyone to know that he was working for and with the big homies. He claimed that this was even more so true whenever Psycho would drink. As they say, liquor sometimes loosens up the tongue and causes people to expose things they normally wouldn't talk about if they wouldn't have been drinking. Psycho told Trix that he was running with the homies and that he was collecting their taxes. On other occasions, Psycho referenced Mono and Chewy, whom Trix knew to be members of the Mexican Mafia. Unlike Clarence, Trix was actually a street gang member. Trix was originally a member of a street gang known as Slows 13. At that time, other members included Psycho and Whisper, both of which are included in the indictment. Whisper apparently joined the gang after Trix was doing his second bid in 1994. Trix originally went to state prison between 1991 and 1993 for commercial burglary. After paroling and briefly staying out, he caught his second case in 1994 for vehicular manslaughter related to a drunk driving accident. He was released on or about May 1st of 1999. During that particular incarceration, Slow's 13 merged with the City Terrace gang. Because Trix was already a member of Slow's 13 and was incarcerated during the merge, he was basically walked into the City Terrace gang. Trix wasn't really considered to be an official leader of the gang, but he had some clout and respect due to his relatively older age and his prison credibility. This resonated more with the younger guys. So during the time he was locked up for vehicular manslaughter, Trix frequently spoke to Psycho after Psycho was released from the California Youth Authority. Psycho spent a lot of time in YA and was basically considered to be a YA baby, a reference or term used to describe someone who's basically been in the youth authority throughout most, if not all, their adolescent years. So according to Trix, he had known Psycho since they were kids. In 1997 and 1998, Trix spoke to Psycho at least once or twice a week. Psycho was his contact to the neighborhood, and Trix liked to think of himself as City Terrace's link to the big homies behind the wall. Blanco was somebody else that Trix implicated during his interviews with the FBI and the prosecution, despite only talking to him on the phone and never meeting him until he got out of prison. During the time when Trix and Psycho used to talk on the phone, Blanco would sometimes be there at Psycho's house and he put him on the phone with Trix. That was the extent of his interaction with them. He only met Blanco, however, after Trix was released from prison in May of 1999. Trix also implicated another City Terrace gang member who was named in the indictment, a guy by the name of Dominic Solo Gonzalez. In fact, it was from Solo that Trix first learned that Slow's 13 had merged with City Terrace when Trix was released from prison in May of 1999. Prior to getting released in May of 1999 and prior to Psycho's arrest in February of 1999, Trix had heard about the Montebello murders from Psycho. In at least one recorded phone call initiated by Trix from Calipatria State Prison, Psycho implicated himself and others in the murders. And of course, this was again during the time when Psycho was drinking. The call was placed on one of the prison's blue monitor phones, and Psycho was drinking Pruno, jailhouse wine, or as we used to call it, Pulque Pronto. During the recorded call, Psycho tells Trix that him, Blanco, and Whisper took care of some business in either Whittier or Montebello for the Pilis. Pili is a reference used to describe a Mexican mafia member in Nahua. Using Nahua in place of sensitive words is a form of covert communication that's utilized by both the Nuestra Familia and the Mexican mafia. There's different dialects, but learning this alternate language for the purpose of covert communication is emphatically encouraged. The cool part about this particular recorded conversation is that Trix makes no attempt to protect Psycho by stopping him or pulling him up when he hears him slipping. He doesn't try to pump his brakes or stop him, despite the fact that he's obviously feeling his liquor. Instead, he just allows him to keep talking. That should have been a red flag right there. Because when you see a homie in the water and he's sinking, you don't stand there and watch him sink. You throw him a lifeline and pull him out the water. That recorded call actually ended up being a critical part of the case. It wasn't only damaging to Psycho, it also hurt Whisper and Blanco as well. So Trix found out that Psycho had been arrested and called Psycho's home sometime after the arrest. Psycho's wife Mindy told Trix that Psycho and a bunch of others had been swooped up and arrested for a triple murder and a laundry list of other crimes. At that time, Trix assumed that Psycho, Blanco, and Whisper had killed someone on behalf of the Mexican Mafia. And Trix still didn't know the details. People on the streets were floating rumors and speculating, but he didn't find out what happened until his release in May. When he paroled, he started asking around about Psycho and the circumstances surrounding his arrest. It wasn't until he tapped in with some of his other homies from City Terrace that he got the details and they told him. About a week after his release, he went to borrow money from Solo. It was during this time that he met Blanco. Keep in mind that although a handful of these guys got picked up for homicide, the indictment didn't come down until later. So a lot of these guys like Blanco, Chewy, Spider, Whisper, and others still hadn't been picked up yet. When Trix asked Solo about the circumstances that led up to Psycho's arrest, Solo was real vague about it. He was vague about his arrest and also about what had happened. Shortly after meeting with Solo, about 1 or 2 weeks after his release, Trix met with Whisper in front of Whisper's house. Whisper said that him and Blanco had taken someone out for the big homies because that person owed the homies some money. Trix then scolded Whisper for getting involved in something like this while his girlfriend was pregnant. He also scolded Whisper for doing the Mexican Mafia's dirty work. He asked Whisper what was in it for him and what did he have to gain from it besides being another loyal pawn. And now the exposure of possibly getting gaffled up. Whisper looked up to Trix and would often turn to him for guidance. That's the kind of relationship that they had. So several weeks later, Trix and Whisper met again at Whisper's house, and Whisper told him more details. He told him that him, Blanco, and Psycho were called and told to go to a shop, either a body shop, a tire shop, or a stereo shop, in order to locate the target. Once there, they called an unidentified contact person and stated that they had found the target and asked for direction on what to do. It was at this time that they were told to carry out the murder. Once they got clearance to proceed with the hit, they put a plan in motion and they all agreed to their roles. The plan was simple. There was nothing complicated or intricate about it. They'd use Psycho's van to not only get to the destination where the target was supposed to be, but they would also use this same van to get away. Psycho agreed to be the getaway driver. Whisper and Blanco would be strapped, and together they jump out in unison. It was also agreed that they'd open fire on the target, and that if either one of them failed to discharge their weapons, this would be considered an act of cowardice. Although it wasn't stipulated, this basically inferred that it would be grounds for drumming that individual out. On the night of the incident, they pulled up to the location in Psycho's van. The location was some kind of shop. Whisper and Blanco entered the shop and got a visual on the target. After confirming that it was in fact the intended target, they both started shooting until they were out of rounds. Whisper also confessed that both of the weapons were .380 handguns. Whisper said that the target's name was Richard and that Trix should know him as he used to live in his neighborhood. This was in fact the same Richard that Trix had alluded to in his statement. If you guys remember, Trix said he had known Richard personally as his family had owned several properties in the City Terrace area and that Richard was also his meth dealer. Whisper went on to tell Trix that Richard had burned the wrong person for either money or drugs, and of course the wrong person was Apili, a Mexican mafia member. When Trix implicated these guys in this murder, he claimed that this was the only time he spoke to Whisper about the murders and that it was never brought up again. At some point after May of 1999, Psycho passed a message to Trix via Mindy, Psycho's wife, that Trix should warn Blanco and Whisper to leave the neighborhood because they would be arrested in connection with the murder. This was information Psycho had apparently assumed based on questions that the homicide investigators had been asking several people. Trix did in fact pass this message on to the two of them, and this was confirmed in another recorded conversation between Mindy and Psycho. Unfortunately, like most indictment cases, this one had its due share of wiretaps and jail-recorded phone calls. Why Whisper and Blanco failed to heed this warning is anybody's guess, but coincidentally, they were picked up within days of Trix relaying the message. In his first interview, Trix said that he received a letter from Psycho and that he recognized the handwriting. Furthermore, he stated that he immediately burned the letter as soon as he read it and realized that it was an incriminating piece of evidence that could have potentially hurt Psycho. Not long after that, sometime in early June of 1999, Trix was told by Mindy that Psycho wanted him to contact Clarence for the sole purpose of having him dispose of some guns. This is what prompted Trix to contact Clarence about getting rid of the guns. He was told to get rid of the things which he understood to mean the murder weapons and that Clarence had the guns. In his interview on June 24, 2001, Trix stated that he first went to Clarence's parents' house in City Terrace and then went to Clarence's house in Pico Rivera. Upon meeting Clarence for the first time, Trix thought that Clarence might be an informant. Trix would later say that he just got bad vibes from Clarence and that he was acting out of character during the entire time they went to dig up the guns and get rid of them. Like Clarence, Trix detailed how they dug up the guns, and he also confirmed that they were both semi-automatic .380s. He then went on to say that it was his idea to take the guns apart and break them down into two pieces, the grip and barrel and the slide. According to Trix, he threw the grip and barrel of the chrome gun over the south side of a bridge over the San Gabriel River and the slide over the north side. Then he had Clarence drive him to an area near the Montebello Town Center where he discarded the slide of the black gun. After this, they got back on the freeway. As they were driving on the freeway, he said he threw the grip and barrel at a split at the Garfield exit. Once he got back to the pad, he called Mindy and told her that he had taken care of Psycho's request. He did this to give Psycho some reassurance and to let it be known that he took care of business. Trix admitted himself that it felt good knowing that he was being loyal to someone who he considered to be a friend. But obviously that loyalty waned fast as soon as he was threatened and propositioned by the homicide detective. Loyalty went out the window and self-preservation eventually won out. After Trix's first interview, like Clarence, he also accompanied law enforcement to the same sites that Clarence had taken them to. At that point, law enforcement was confident that they had enough evidence by two inside sources to wrap up their case and begin making the arrest, and that's exactly what they did. In the early morning hours, several different teams of law enforcement by a multitude of both state and federal agencies converged on a number of different locations. On the morning of the first attempt to arrest Whisper, Trix picked him up in City Terrace and drove him to his sister's house in South Central Los Angeles. Trix and his wife Charlene gave Whisper $150. It definitely beats a blank, but when you're moving in the shadows and you're trying to duck and dodge law enforcement, $150 ain't gonna get you far. Not long after that, on either August 2nd or August 3rd, Whisper came to a party at Trick's house. Only certain people were invited to this party, and only a select few people knew about it. But someone tipped law enforcement off, telling them that Whisper was going to be there. Whisper was arrested that night, along with Tricks, who by then had also been implicated by Clarence. Like Clarence, after he was arrested, Tricks was obviously spooked into cooperating by law enforcement. I'm sure these savvy homicide investigators probably presented the worst case scenario to them both. You're going to go down with the whole team, you're going to be charged with aiding and abetting or accessory after the fact, yada yada yada. Whatever they told them, I'm sure they spread it on thick and spooked these guys into believing that they were looking at decades and decades in prison. The deck was definitely stacked against both of these guys. And aside from using Tricks and Clarence, they also used the debriefing reports from Max Torvisco, as he was also aware of who had the guns and the details of the murders. Torvisco was an influential Mexican mafia member who cooperated in other cases. I'm not trying to be critical of how some of these other guys operated, because I might not have all the information. But based on what I know about this case, I'm just going to say this. After hearing about the details of this story, what I couldn't understand is why these guys made getting rid of some dirty weapons so complicated. It really didn't have to be as complicated as they made it. As I'm sure most of you know, something like this is kept on a need-to-know basis. The more people that know about it, the more you increase your chances of getting caught up. It's bad enough that you have to worry about those people who are directly involved, but these guys just kept on digging themselves into a deeper hole. Maybe this was the first time they had to deal with a situation where they had to get rid of weapons that had bodies on them. I don't know. But it just seemed like even taking a trip to Home Depot and renting a torch so someone could have melted those guns down in the backyard would have been a lot easier and would have came with a lot less to worry about. I don't think I'd be comfortable breaking a gun down into two pieces, the barrel and the grip, and then tossing it over a bridge somewhere. That would have weighed on my mind, and I would have been worried about someone finding them. There's a lot to take away from this story, as well as what I touched on with respects to Eddie Castro from Barrio Nuevo Estrada. I don't think I need to go into detail about the lack of trust that's no longer being invested in these criminal organizations. These stories of betrayal, backstabbing, and disloyalty run rampant. They're everywhere. Back in the 80s and 90s, it seemed like there was a lot more emphasis that was being placed on things like security and implementing some of the safeguards that ensure we maintain some level of protection. These types of things were taken serious, and we understood that the integrity of our security depended on it. Nowadays, these things are thrown to the wind and nobody seems to care anymore. There's more emphasis placed on people bragging and boasting about the crimes they were involved in and who they committed these crimes for. And this is in spite of the fact that it's even harder to find people you can trust these days, especially in the realm of criminal activity and the whole criminal underworld. Things used to be done on a need-to-know basis. If you were involved in some type of illicit criminal activity and there was ample reasoning for you to be in the know, then you were a part of that circle and you were kept in the loop. But if you weren't involved and there was no reason for you to know, then it was none of your business. There was even a stance that used to be taken by those who weren't involved because they understood the dynamics of how it could actually be detrimental to not only the integrity of security, but also to them if information was ever leaked. They had no desire to be included in the scope of that circle. Therefore, it was in their best interest not to know about certain things. In other words, if there was somebody bragging or boasting or trying to discuss something like a crime that was committed or a homicide, you had those that would say, with all due respect, that's none of my business and I don't even want to know about it. There was no reason for them to, and they understood that if they were exposed to something, that they would then be scrutinized and looked at if that information was ever leaked out. From a practical standpoint, sometimes because of circumstances that are beyond our control, like being locked up or being in a predicament where we can't take on more of a proactive role, we have to seek the assistance of others when we find ourselves in a quandary. That's just something that can't be avoided. But this is worst case scenario. When you don't have to depend on other people to help you, or when you don't need to expose things to other people who don't need to know, then you shouldn't, as it's more likely going to come back to hurt you. I don't know all the intricate details of Whisper, Blanco, and Psycho's circumstances when they needed help disposing these weapons. I'm sure they felt they could trust Clarence and this other guy Tricks. Why wouldn't they? These were supposed to be their friends, especially being from the same hood and having some history together. But unfortunately for them, both of these guys ended up folding. And no matter how good of a judge of character you might think you are, or how much you might think you know someone, you just never know what they're gonna do or how they're gonna respond when they're faced with adversity. A good rule of thumb, fly solo as much as you can, whenever you can, and keep your business to yourself, no matter what it is. There's nothing positive to gain by letting other people know about your business. These are just liabilities you create for yourself. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank all of you for tapping in and for continuing to support the channel. I've got more stories dropping, so stay tapped in for the next one. As you guys can see, I'm trying to shorten up my story so that I can possibly get out more to you. We'll see how it goes. It still doesn't do nothing to fix the issues that slow me down with YouTube. Anyways, as this one goes out, I'm already working on the next one. I'll be doing a live either tonight or tomorrow, depending on when I get these stories out. Until then, you guys enjoy the rest of your week and keep pushing that positivity. With that said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.